It's 1776, and the air in colonial Virginia is thick with tension. While most people think the Declaration of Independence was America's first cry for freedom, there's actually an earlier story that's been hiding in plain sight. Just weeks before Thomas Jefferson would pen those famous words about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a brilliant lawyer named George Mason was already crafting something extraordinary in Virginia. He wasn't just writing another political document, he was essentially creating the world's first modern Bill of Rights. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Mason had been watching the British tighten their grip on the colonies for years. Every new tax, every restriction on trade, every limitation on colonial self-governance felt like another chain being forged. But unlike many of his contemporaries who focused on economic grievances, Mason saw something deeper at stake, the very idea of what it meant to be human. You see, Mason understood that the real battle wasn't just about tea taxes or stamp duties. It was about whether ordinary people had inherent rights that no government, not even the mighty British Empire, could take away. This was a radical idea that would have made most European monarchs break out in a cold sweat. The genius of Mason's approach was how he structured his argument. Instead of simply listing complaints against King George III, he started with a bold declaration: all men are by nature equally free and independent. Think about how revolutionary that statement was in 1776. Most of the world still operated under the belief that some people were born to rule while others were born to serve. But Mason wasn't finished. He went on to spell out specific rights that he believed belonged to every person: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to a fair trial. These weren't privileges granted by a generous king. They were fundamental human rights that existed before any government was ever formed. What makes this story even more compelling is the personal risk involved. Mason and his fellow Virginia delegates weren't just writing an academic paper. They were essentially signing their own death warrants if the revolution failed. The British considered this kind of thinking treasonous, punishable by hanging. Yet Mason pressed forward, driven by a vision of a society where power flowed from the people upward, not from kings downward. He was literally reimagining how human civilization could work, and he was doing it with nothing but words on paper and an unshakable belief in human dignity. The ripple effects of Mason's work would prove more powerful than he could have ever imagined, setting the stage for a revolution that would echo across centuries and continents. Let me tell you about one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. George Mason, the man who essentially invented the American Bill of Rights, refused to sign the very constitution that would govern the nation he helped create. And the reason why will absolutely blow your mind. Picture George Mason in his study at Gunston Hall, his Virginia plantation. It's the spring of 1776, and this brilliant lawyer is staring at a blank piece of paper, knowing that what he's about to write could change everything. Mason wasn't your typical politician. He was a deep thinker who had spent years studying philosophy, law, and human nature. What made Mason so unique was his obsession with precision. While other revolutionary leaders were content with grand, sweeping statements about freedom, Mason wanted to get into the nitty-gritty details. What exactly did freedom mean? How could you protect it? What specific rights did people possess that no government should ever be allowed to touch? As he dipped his quill into the inkwell, Mason was essentially trying to solve a puzzle that had stumped philosophers for centuries. How do you create a government strong enough to protect people, but not so strong that it becomes the very thing you need protection from? The document he crafted was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Mason didn't just say people had rights. He listed them out one by one with the precision of a master craftsman: freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial. Each right was carefully considered and clearly defined. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Fast forward 11 years to 1787, and Mason finds himself at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The same man who had written the blueprint for American rights was now watching his fellow founders create a new national government, and Mason was horrified. The proposed Constitution, in Mason's view, gave too much power to the federal government and didn't include enough protections for individual rights. While other delegates were focused on creating a strong central authority, Mason was asking the uncomfortable question: what happens when that authority decides to abuse its power? Day after day, Mason stood up in that sweltering Philadelphia hall, arguing that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. His fellow delegates thought he was being unnecessarily cautious. After all, they reasoned, the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly allowed it to do. But Mason had studied history. He knew that governments had a tendency to expand their power over time, and that written protections were the only real safeguard against tyranny. When his proposed amendments were voted down, Mason made one of the most principled stands in American history. On the final day of the convention, when it came time to sign the Constitution, George Mason simply refused. The man who had written Virginia's Declaration of Rights couldn't bring himself to sign a document that he believed left Americans vulnerable to the very kind of government oppression they had just fought a war to escape. Mason's refusal to sign wasn't just symbolic, it was prophetic. His concerns about the Constitution's lack of individual protections would eventually lead to the creation of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that guarantee the very freedoms Mason had been fighting for all along. In the end, the architect of American liberty proved that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to go along with the crowd, even when that crowd includes your closest friends and allies. You know how sometimes the most powerful ideas are born out of pure frustration? That's exactly what happened with Virginia's Declaration of Rights. It wasn't some abstract philosophical exercise. It was George Mason and his fellow Virginians saying enough is enough to decades of British heavy-handedness. Picture colonial Virginia in the 1760s and early 70s. Every few months it seemed like another ship would arrive from London, carrying news of some fresh restriction or tax. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each one felt like another turn of the screw. But what really got under Mason's skin wasn't just the money the British were demanding. It was the way they were going about it. You see, for generations, Virginians had grown accustomed to a certain way of life. They had their own newspapers that printed what they wanted to print. They worshipped in their own churches without interference from government officials. When someone was accused of a crime, they expected to be tried by a jury of their neighbors, not shipped off to England to face unknown judges. But as tensions escalated, the British began chipping away at these freedoms. Colonial newspapers found themselves censored or shut down entirely. Religious dissenters faced harassment. The British started talking about trying colonial troublemakers in British courts, thousands of miles away from their homes and families. Mason watched all of this happening and realized something profound. The British weren't just violating colonial rights, they were violating human rights. The freedoms that Virginians cherished weren't special privileges granted by the king. They were fundamental aspects of what it meant to be human. This was an absolutely revolutionary idea for the time. In most of the world, people understood that rights came from rulers. Kings granted privileges to their subjects, and those privileges could be taken away just as easily as they were given. But Mason was arguing for something completely different, that certain rights existed before any government was ever formed, and that these rights were so fundamental that no earthly power had the authority to revoke them. Think about how radical this concept was. Mason was essentially saying that a poor farmer in Virginia had the same inherent right to free speech as King George III himself. In an age when most people still believed in the divine right of kings, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The genius of Mason's approach was how he turned British oppression into a teaching moment for the world. Instead of just complaining about specific British policies, he used those grievances as a launching pad to articulate universal principles that could apply to any society, anywhere, at any time. When Mason wrote about freedom of the press, he wasn't just thinking about colonial newspapers being shut down by British officials. He was establishing the principle that the free flow of information was essential to human dignity. When he wrote about religious liberty, he wasn't just responding to Anglican persecution of Baptist preachers in Virginia. He was declaring that every person had the right to worship according to their own conscience. Perhaps most importantly, when Mason wrote about the right to a fair trial, he was responding to British threats to drag colonists across the Atlantic to face justice in foreign courts. But he was also establishing the principle that justice requires not just any trial, but a trial conducted according to fair procedures with proper protections for the accused. These ideas were so powerful that they would outlive the specific circumstances that created them. The seeds that Mason planted in Virginia's Declaration of Rights would eventually grow into constitutions and bills of rights around the world, inspiring freedom movements on every continent. What started as a response to British tyranny became a blueprint for human liberty that continues to influence how we think about rights and government to this day. Imagine you're sitting in a London coffee house in 1776 and someone hands you a copy of Virginia's Declaration of Rights. As you read through it, you'd probably think these colonial upstarts had completely lost their minds. Because what Mason and his fellow Virginians were proposing wasn't just radical, it was a complete inversion of everything the British Empire stood for. For over 1,000 years, the basic assumption across Europe had been pretty straightforward. Rulers rule and subjects obey. Kings derived their authority from God, and everyone else derived their rights from kings. It was a nice, tidy hierarchy that kept everyone in their proper place. But Mason's declaration turned this entire worldview upside down. Every single line of the Virginia Declaration was like a dagger aimed at the heart of imperial authority. When Mason wrote that all men are by nature equally free and independent, he wasn't just making a philosophical statement. He was declaring that King George III had no more inherent right to rule than any farmer in Fairfax County. Can you imagine how that must have sounded to British ears? But Mason didn't stop there. He went on to argue that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Mason was essentially telling the British Empire that its authority in America was illegitimate because Americans had never actually agreed to be ruled by Parliament or the Crown. This was the kind of thinking that kept British officials awake at night. Because if the idea caught on, if people throughout the empire started believing that government existed to serve them rather than the other way around, the whole imperial system would collapse like a house of cards. What made Mason's declaration so dangerous wasn't just its ideas, but its timing. This wasn't some abstract philosophical treatise written by a professor in his ivory tower. This was an official government document, adopted by the Virginia Convention, as they were literally in the process of breaking away from British rule. Mason wasn't just theorizing about popular government, he was helping to create one. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Just a few weeks after Virginia adopted Mason's declaration, Thomas Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence. And if you read the two documents side by side, the influence is unmistakable. Jefferson's famous phrase about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was directly inspired by Mason's language about inherent rights and human equality. But here's what's really mind-blowing. The influence of Mason's work didn't stop with American independence. Fast forward to 1789, and French revolutionaries were reading Virginia's declaration as they crafted their own Declaration of the Rights of Man. Jump ahead to 1948, and Eleanor Roosevelt kept a copy of Virginia's declaration on her desk as she helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. Mason had essentially created a template for human freedom that would inspire liberation movements for centuries to come. Every time people rose up against tyranny, whether in France, Latin America, or anywhere else in the world, they could point to Virginia's declaration as proof that their cause was just. The British Empire, which had seemed so permanent and unshakable in 1776, would eventually crumble under the weight of these ideas. Not immediately, of course, but the seeds of its destruction were planted in that Virginia Convention Hall when Mason declared that governments exist to serve people, not the other way around. What started as a colonial rebellion in Virginia had become something much bigger, a new way of thinking about human dignity and political authority that would reshape the world. Mason and his fellow Virginians hadn't just declared independence from Britain, they had declared independence from the entire old order of kings and subjects, creating a new model of government based on human equality and popular consent. And that, my friends, is how a group of colonial rebels with nothing but pens and paper managed to shake the foundations of the mightiest empire on earth. Here's something that might surprise you. While we often think of the Founding Fathers as these larger-than-life heroes, the truth is they were essentially running an underground operation that could have gotten them all killed. The Virginia Declaration of Rights wasn't written in some grand marble hall with fanfare and ceremony. It was crafted in secret, by men who knew that every word they wrote was potentially their own death sentence. Picture this scene. It's May of 1776 and delegates are gathering in Williamsburg for the Virginia Convention. But this isn't your typical political meeting. British spies are everywhere, and everyone knows it. Royal Governor Lord Dunmore has already fled the colony, but his network of informants is still very much active. One wrong word to the wrong person, and you could find yourself on a ship to London, facing charges of high treason. George Mason understood the stakes better than most. As he sat down to draft the declaration, he knew that British law was crystal clear about this kind of activity. Anyone who challenged the authority of the Crown wasn't just committing a crime, they were committing the ultimate crime, one that carried the penalty of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. That's not just execution. That's execution designed to be as brutal and public as possible, to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking of rebellion. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Mason and his fellow delegates weren't reckless revolutionaries. They were successful, respectable men with everything to lose. Mason owned thousands of acres and had 9 children at home. He could have easily kept quiet, paid his taxes, and lived comfortably under British rule. Instead, he chose to risk everything for an idea. The secrecy wasn't just about avoiding British spies, though. The delegates also had to worry about loyalists in their own communities. Virginia might have been moving toward independence, but it wasn't unanimous. There were still plenty of colonists who considered themselves loyal British subjects, and they wouldn't hesitate to report suspicious activity to the authorities. So the real work of revolution happened in whispered conversations, in private homes, in late-night meetings where men spoke in code and watched over their shoulders. When Mason was writing his first drafts of the Declaration, he couldn't even trust his own servants. Papers had to be hidden, and meetings had to be disguised as social gatherings. What's really remarkable is how this atmosphere of secrecy and danger actually improved the document. Because Mason and his colleagues knew they might only get one chance to get this right, they labored over every single word. They couldn't afford to be vague or ambiguous. If they were caught, they wanted to make sure their ideas would survive, even if they didn't. The Virginia Convention itself was a masterpiece of revolutionary theater. On the surface, it looked like a normal colonial assembly dealing with routine business. But underneath, the delegates were systematically dismantling British authority and replacing it with something entirely new. They had to be careful not to move too fast, or they'd spook the moderates. But they also couldn't move too slowly, or they'd lose momentum. Mason's genius was in understanding that the Declaration of Rights couldn't just be a list of complaints against the British. It had to be something bigger, a vision of what they were fighting for, not just what they were fighting against. Because if they were going to ask people to risk their lives for revolution, they needed to offer them something worth dying for. The courage this took is almost impossible to imagine today. These men weren't professional revolutionaries or radical agitators. They were lawyers, planters, and merchants who had comfortable lives and bright futures under the existing system. But they were willing to throw it all away because they believed that some principles were more important than personal safety. When Mason finally presented his draft to the Virginia Convention, he was essentially asking his fellow delegates to sign their own death warrants. Every man who voted in favor of the Declaration knew that there was no going back. They were either going to win their independence or they were going to hang together. The fact that Virginia's Declaration of Rights was born in such dangerous circumstances makes its influence even more remarkable. These weren't just pretty words written by comfortable philosophers. They were hard-won principles, purchased with real risk and genuine sacrifice by people who understood exactly what they were putting on the line. That's what gave the Declaration its power. Not just the beauty of its ideas, but the courage of the men who were willing to die for them. You know how sometimes you write something thinking it's just for one specific situation, but then it takes on a life of its own? That's exactly what happened with George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. What started as a response to British oppression in one colonial backwater ended up changing the entire world's understanding of human freedom. The first domino to fall was obvious enough. Just 3 weeks after Virginia adopted Mason's declaration, Thomas Jefferson sat down in Philadelphia to write the Declaration of Independence. And here's the fascinating part. Jefferson didn't just draw inspiration from Mason's work, he practically copied whole sections of it. That famous line about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's Jefferson's elegant rephrasing of Mason's language about inherent rights and the pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson wasn't just borrowing pretty phrases. He was taking Mason's revolutionary idea that rights come from nature, not from government, and broadcasting it to the entire world. When the Continental Congress approved Jefferson's declaration, they were essentially endorsing Mason's philosophy and sending it across the Atlantic to every royal court in Europe. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. French intellectuals like Voltaire and Rousseau had been writing about natural rights for decades, but Mason's declaration proved that these weren't just abstract theories. Here was a real government dealing with real problems that had actually implemented these ideas. The Virginia Declaration became required reading in the salons of Paris, where revolutionary ideas were brewing. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the influence was unmistakable. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside Washington in the American Revolution, worked closely with Thomas Jefferson to draft France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And guess what document they used as their primary model? That's right, Mason's Virginia Declaration. But the influence didn't stop there. As news of the American experiment spread throughout Europe, Mason's ideas began popping up in the most unlikely places. Polish revolutionaries quoted the Virginia Declaration in their struggle against Russian domination. Irish independence activists carried copies of it in their coat pockets. Even in distant Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar drew inspiration from Mason's vision of popular government and individual rights. Here's what's really remarkable. Mason's influence continued to grow even as the world changed around it. When the newly independent United States realized that their Constitution needed a Bill of Rights, where do you think they turned for guidance? James Madison, who drafted the first 10 amendments, had Mason's Virginia Declaration sitting right there on his desk as he worked. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Mason's fingerprints are still all over the world's most important human rights documents. When Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the United Nations Commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, she kept a copy of Virginia's declaration as her constant companion. The language about inherent human dignity, about rights that exist regardless of what any government says, that all traces back to what Mason wrote in Williamsburg in 1776. But perhaps the most powerful testament to Mason's legacy is how his ideas have inspired ordinary people fighting for freedom throughout history. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, activists like Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly referenced the Virginia Declaration's promise that all men are created equal. When Nelson Mandela emerged from prison in 1990, one of the first documents he cited was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which itself was built on the foundation that Mason had laid. Even today, when protesters gather in places like Hong Kong or Belarus, or anywhere else where people are struggling for freedom, they're carrying signs and chanting slogans that echo ideas first articulated in a small colonial assembly hall in Virginia nearly 2.5 centuries ago. What makes this legacy so extraordinary is that Mason never intended to write for the ages. He was just trying to solve an immediate problem, how to protect Virginians from British tyranny. But because he grounded his solution in universal principles rather than particular grievances, he created something that could speak to people facing oppression anywhere, at any time. The Virginia Declaration of Rights wasn't just a document, it was a seed. And like any good seed, it kept sprouting in new soil, adapted to new climates, but always carrying the essential DNA of Mason's original insight, that human beings have inherent worth and dignity that no government has the right to violate. That's the kind of legacy most writers can only dream of, words that continue to inspire and liberate people long after their author has turned to dust. Here's the thing that blows my mind about the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It wasn't really about politics at all. Sure, it looked like a political document, and it certainly had political consequences, but at its heart, Mason's declaration was something much more profound. It was a complete reimagining of what it means to be human. Think about the world in 1776. For thousands of years, human societies had been built on a pretty simple premise. Some people are born to rule, and others are born to be ruled. Kings claimed divine authority. Nobles inherited their status through bloodlines. Even in the most enlightened societies, your station in life was largely determined by the circumstances of your birth. But then along comes George Mason, with this absolutely radical idea. What if none of that matters? What if the accident of being born in a palace doesn't make you any more inherently valuable than being born in a log cabin? What if every single human being, regardless of their circumstances, possesses the same fundamental dignity? This wasn't just revolutionary thinking, it was dangerous thinking. Because if Mason was right, then the entire social order that had governed human civilization for millennia was built on a lie. Kings weren't divinely appointed. Nobles weren't naturally superior. The poor weren't destined to remain poor because that's how God intended it. Mason's genius was in how he presented this earth-shattering idea. He didn't start with a frontal attack on monarchy or aristocracy. Instead, he began with a simple, almost innocent-sounding statement. All men are by nature equally free and independent. But packed into those 8 words was enough explosive power to topple governments around the world. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Mason was writing in a society built on slavery. Virginia in 1776 was a place where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, where a person's skin color could determine whether they lived as a free citizen or died as property. And yet Mason was bold enough to declare that all men, all people, are created equal. Now Mason himself was a slaveholder, which creates this incredibly complex moral tension at the heart of his work. How could someone who owned other human beings write so eloquently about human equality? It's one of those historical contradictions that makes you realize how messy and complicated real life always is, even when people are doing genuinely revolutionary things. But here's what's fascinating. The ideas Mason unleashed were bigger than Mason himself. Once you put the concept of universal human equality out into the world, it takes on a life of its own. You can't contain it or control it. The logic of human equality doesn't stop at property lines or skin color or gender or any other artificial boundary that people try to create. That's why the Virginia Declaration became such a powerful tool for future generations fighting for freedom. When abolitionists like Frederick Douglass argued against slavery, they pointed to Mason's words about all men being created equal. When women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton demanded the right to vote, they used the same language about inherent human rights. When civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. challenged segregation, they were essentially asking America to live up to the promises Mason had made. The revolution of ideas that Mason started in Virginia didn't stop with American independence. It kept spreading, kept evolving, kept challenging new forms of oppression and inequality. Every time someone stood up and said, "I deserve to be treated with dignity because I'm a human being," they were channeling the spirit of Mason's declaration. What's really extraordinary is how this revolution of ideas changed not just how we think about government, but how we think about ourselves. Before Mason, most people accepted that inequality was natural and inevitable. After Mason, people began to believe that equality was natural and inequality was what needed to be justified. This shift in thinking is so fundamental that we sometimes take it for granted today. But imagine trying to explain to someone from the ancient world that a peasant has the same inherent worth as an emperor. They'd think you'd lost your mind. Yet that's exactly the revolution of thought that Mason helped launch. The Virginia Declaration of Rights proved that ideas really can change the world. Not armies or weapons or wealth, but simple ideas about human dignity and equality. Mason showed that sometimes the most powerful revolution happens not in the streets but in people's minds, when they suddenly realize that things don't have to be the way they've always been, and that every human being deserves to be free. That's a revolution that's still ongoing today, wherever people are fighting for recognition of their fundamental human worth and dignity. So here we are at the end of this incredible journey, and I have to ask, isn't it amazing how a group of colonial rebels with nothing but quill pens and revolutionary ideas managed to change the entire trajectory of human history? Think about what George Mason and his fellow Virginians were up against in 1776. They lived in a world where freedom was essentially a luxury item, something that only kings and nobles could afford, while everyone else had to make do with whatever scraps of liberty their rulers decided to toss their way. For most of human history, that's just how things worked. You were born into your station, you stayed in your station, and you didn't ask too many questions about why things had to be that way. But Mason and his companions dared to dream something different. They looked around at this world of kings and subjects, of masters and servants, of the powerful and the powerless, and they said, What if it doesn't have to be this way? What if every single person, regardless of who they are or where they come from, deserves to be free? That dream seemed impossible at the time. The British Empire was the most powerful force on earth. The idea that a handful of colonial upstarts could challenge centuries of tradition and established authority must have seemed like pure fantasy. But Mason and his fellow revolutionaries understood something that their opponents didn't. Ideas, when they're grounded in truth and expressed with courage, have a power that no army can match. The Virginia Declaration of Rights proved that you don't need to be born in a palace to have something valuable to say about human dignity. You don't need a royal bloodline to understand what freedom means. And you don't need permission from your betters to stand up and declare that all people deserve to be treated with respect and given the chance to pursue their own happiness. What started as a local response to British tyranny became a universal declaration of human worth. Mason's words about equality and natural rights traveled across oceans and through centuries, inspiring people who faced completely different challenges but shared the same fundamental desire to be free. The most remarkable thing about this story is that it's still happening today. Every time someone stands up to injustice, every time a person refuses to accept that inequality is inevitable, every time a community comes together to demand better treatment from their government, they're carrying forward the revolution that Mason started in that Virginia Convention Hall nearly 2.5 centuries ago. Mason and his companions proved something that tyrannical governments throughout history have tried to deny: that ordinary people, when they come together around shared principles, can accomplish extraordinary things. They showed that courage doesn't require superpowers or special training. Sometimes it just requires the willingness to pick up a pen and write down what you believe to be true, even when the whole world seems to be against you. The Virginia Declaration of Rights reminds us that freedom isn't something that gets handed down from above. It's something that gets built from below by people who refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been. Mason's legacy lives on every time someone chooses hope over fear, equality over hierarchy, and human dignity over arbitrary power. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, the story of Virginia's Declaration offers us something precious: proof that ideas really can change everything, and that ordinary people really can make a difference. Mason and his fellow revolutionaries started with nothing but their convictions and their courage, and they ended up reshaping human civilization. That's the kind of legacy that reminds us why history matters, not just as a collection of old stories, but as a source of inspiration for anyone who still believes that a better world is possible.